You don't want to take a big 8 centimeter incision. We don't even have that big retractors in our operation theatre. So this is a very beautiful technique. It is applicable for variety of situations: extraforaminal disc, lumbar canal stenosis, not just for discectomy, fusions. Some neurosurgeons do tumor work using these tubes. The next application is in lumbar canal stenosis, wherein you need to decompress these lateral recesses. So we do what is known as an over-the-roof technique. So the tube goes in, and you will do your ipsilateral decompression, and you angulate the tube as well as the table. I'll show you in a few seconds as to how this is done, and decompress the opposite side. So the entire opposite side is left intact. It's not touched at all. The bony roof is left intact. There is a small little laminotomy on this particular side. And again, this is a big boon to obese patients. You have to see it to believe it. Yeah. So here I have, my tube is on the opposite side now. So I am focusing on this area. You can see the central chorda there, the nerve root on the opposite side. So you can trace the nerve root all the way from its exit from the dural sac up to into the foramen, and now it comes to my side, the ipsilateral side, and I am deroofing the ipsilateral lateral recess. So that is the lateral aspect, the root and the disc. So complete, decompression from one end to the other can be performed. So see, this is how it is done, and this is the ipsilateral side. This is the contralateral side. This is the size of the scar. Now imagine, a patient with this kind of canal stenosis undergoes an open laminectomy. This is the amount of scar tissue you leave behind later on. Now here, there is hardly any footprint of surgery here. I have gone from this side. See, the entire soft tissue and bony envelope on this side, and majority of that on the ipsilateral side is left intact. So again, these are pre-op, post-ops of patients, who have undergone surgery. If it is 2 levels, especially at L4-5, L5-S1, the converge posteriorly, you can do a 2-level decompression discectomy using a single port. This is a patient with a synovial cyst here. This is a synovial cyst. Of course, many of us do a cystectomy, but there is a lot of stress in literature on fusion for synovial cysts. So if there is a synovial cyst, always fuse, saying that that it is unstable situation. But see, following a decompression, we went from the opposite side. The facet joints on ipsilateral side is left intact. We are just removed this like a grape. We not even touched the facet joint on the opposite side. So hardly causing any instability. I'll show you. So this is the ipsilateral side. This is the cyst here. This cyst can be really, really painful. So this is the dural sac. This is the contralateral side. So you can see that hemorrhagic fluid coming from the cyst once it is punctured. So you are able to remove the cyst. You are able to conserve the stability or protect the stability of the spinal segment. Again, there are concerns as to whether you can do a thorough decompression or not. This is a very tight canal. You can see this is post-op. Hardly any collateral damage to the soft tissues. Again, another case of synovial cyst. We are going from the opposite side. The next extension is obviously spinal fusion, and we have a great experience with this for all kind of situations where indications where it is indicated: degenerative listhesis, lytic listhesis, central large disc herniations, discitis, etc., failed backs. So this is a recently done surgery. It's almost about grade 2.5 listhesis. We did it with all minimal access. So this is someone else's back, but this was done about 15 days back. So even about grade 2.5 listhesis can be done with this particular technique. So what we do is this particular tube goes on one side, that helps in removing the disc, doing a decompression, putting in your bone graft and cage. Then we use percutaneous pedicle screws and rods and perform the fusion. So this is a so here I am putting, this is a very short video, it's otherwise it's 10 minutes. This I put percutaneous screws, this is a rod. So you can see in this inbox here. From the other side I am doing a discectomy. A thorough discectomy is possible by angulating the tube. It is how well you can manipulate the tube, that matters. A thorough curettage of the disc space, as good as you can do it in a open TLIF, insertion of a right size cage. So you can see the soft tissues. Okay, now this is the post-op lateral and AP. Now I'm just extending, this was restricted to lumbar spine, but this is something which we did. This is a patient with an osteoid osteoma, the C2. So we just thought of putting in these tubes rather than exposing from occiput to C3, whatever is required to get a good amount of retraction. So we were right on the spot, the junction of the lamina and the lateral mass. So this is the nidus of the osteoid osteoma. So that is thoroughly removed. The patient left with a small scar. These patients come with pain, osteoid osteoma patients, and you don't want to give them pain. So the best thing we can do is this. We published this in Spine. So this is the post-op result. There is no tumor trace left. So probably at the end of it, we have better understanding of how many things we can do with minimal access. These surgeries help in re-establishing normal anatomy and functioning without much damage to the collateral structures. And as you know, it is a tubular technique and it is very versatile, can be applied for many indications. Thank you.
Just give me 1 minute.
The next speaker will be Dr. Swarnam Hegde, and he will speak on the yes.
Yeah, dynamic solutions.
This one.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, is a pointer.
Thank you.
It's a slight change.
So thank you very much. I'll get down to my talk because I would like to save some time. We are all aware of this cascade of events that lead to what is considered as disc degeneration, and we look at disc degeneration which is in various stages, and then by and large we are looking at the kind of surgeries we'd attempt on the appearance of the disc. By and large, back pain management is essentially conservative, sometimes percutaneous disc surgeries, open disc surgeries, nucleus replacement, facet arthroplasty, total disc replacement, and dynamic solutions. So I'm going to talk of the second last, total disc replacement and dynamic solutions. The biomechanics of the intervertebral disc is degeneration will lead to decreased viscoelastic property, fatigue recovery, decreased ability to attenuate shock, increased load borne by the annulus, increased wear and tear, increased load transfer. So the sequelae changes in intradiscal pressure is very important. Shift of axial load bearing to peripheral zone and end plates and facet. resulting in osteophyte formation, facetal arthropathy, and ligamentous hypertrophy, decreased disc space, and spinal canal stenosis. The question is, what is instability? And from a very long time, we know of the classic, this kind of obvious appearance, there is no question. But otherwise, there is this classic paper by Manohar Punjabi, which talks of clinical instability. And after that, there was this article by Mulholland and Sengupta, which sort of added to this. So what Sengupta added on to this, Dr. Sengupta added on to is this increased abnormal load distribution, increased motion leading to abnormal. And what Manohar Punjabi talked about was abnormal motion. So if you look at a healthy disc like this, then the weight bearing throughout the disc is very healthy and it remains throughout the center. Whereas now when you have a disc degeneration, the weight bearing is altered, leading to eccentric loading and therefore abnormal motion. So the classic followed by this article gives us an idea as to what we are looking at in terms of disc degeneration. And Manohar Punjabi talked about this as the neutral zone, which is in the center, which was essentially painless when the disc is healthy. And as we go, the movement increases. There is peripheral loading, but in a healthy disc, it does not cause any problem. But in a degenerate disc, it can become like this, and that leads to a painful zone, a painful area, even in the neutral zone. So that is what his article is. And as we try and reduce the range of movement, that is what fusion does, it leads to more and more pain-free situations. So what are the goals of dynamic stabilization? Preserve motion, remove abnormal motion, load sharing with disc and facet, and uniform unloading of the disc. So although spinal fusion has been a definitive surgical management of symptomatic lumbar degenerative conditions, continued reports of adjacent level degeneration and suboptimal patient outcomes have prompted the advancement of motion preservation. One of the ways of doing this is total disc replacement. It gives symptom relief, protects the adjacent segment, maintains near normal mobility, restores discal height, provides stability, eliminates graft side morbidity that you see in fusion, and faster recovery and return to work. So what are the indications? Chronic back pain, failure of conservative therapy for more than 6 months, and changes on the MRI, or Swiss Street Disability Index greater than 30%, age usually less than 50 years of age. You could use it in topping off adjacent level disease, degenerative disc disease, slight retrolisthesis, and discogenic pain, and without facet disease. So these are the indications, the contraindications we are all well aware. When there is stenosis, osteoporosis, when there are severe degenerative facet joints, spondylolisthesis, fractures, tumors, infection, etc. There are too many of those available in India. Unfortunately, now there are very few artificial discs available for the lumbar spine. And the surgical technique, all of us know, is to identify the disc and do an en bloc discectomy. Once you've done the discectomy, you position the disc, which should be sort of in the central, and the weight-bearing axis of the disc should be slightly posterior in the axis. And that sort of keeps the disc functioning very well. In the L4, L5 area, you have to be a little cautious because of the iliacs, 2 branches that are coming out, and you need to dissect a little bit more. At the end of surgery, this is what the artificial disc looks like, and this is what the vessels look like post-instrumentation. So there are a few case studies that I would like to talk about. Here is a gentleman who was operated microdiscectomy done twice, and a young man, so we did disc replacement in him. I followed him up for about 6 years with good results. This is a gentleman who came to us from the US, is a stunt man, and he had 2-level discs, and you can see that, and he had undergone a microdiscectomy here and also a microdiscectomy there, but he had discal pain. So we did a 2-level disc replacement in this gentleman. And again, I followed him up for slightly over 7 years and keep in regular touch with him. Last example is of a gentleman who was in his mid-40s, working in in the army in Dubai, and had 2 disc surgeries done here, following which he still had severe pain. Chose to do disc replacements in him. Again, followed him up for a long time. Now, there is a lot of argument disc replacement is going out of fashion in a big way, because the complications of disc replacement in the US have been horrendous because they used it very extensively. So now we come into the area of dynamic stabilization devices. And dynamic stabilization devices basically are divided into 2 categories. They're pedicle screw-based posterior dynamic stabilization devices, or interspinous distraction devices. The interspinous distraction device, the X-Top, the Coflex, the DM, and all that. Now, over the years, in my personal experiences, what I found is the interspinous distraction devices do not work, and we have found that this has failed in most effects. And basically, because of the abnormal biomechanics that the posterior interspinous device produces. It's a simple surgery, but does not give rise to long-term results. So I stopped doing that, and we've gone into posterior dynamic stabilization. Now, posterior dynamic stabilization, controlling the dynamics of a surgically destabilized spine, shielding the facet joints and the disc, decreasing fusion-related effects, and improving anterior load sharing and interbody fusion. So, low back pain with or without leg pain and its relation to segmental instability not fully understood. Standard treatment has been fusion, instrumented or not, with good outcomes ranging between 60 and 80%. Solid fusions do not always correlate with good clinical outcome. So we've all heard about adjacent level disease. I'll go forward. So posterior dynamic stabilization. It is felt that unloading the disc will allow maybe for self-repair and rehydration of the disc. Maybe in the future will allow for regeneration in the presence of stem cells or other advances. So this was the logic of using the posterior dynamic stabilization devices. They came, this is already discussed, and there are 3 generations. The first generation, which is known as the Graf ligament, which was, the article is written by Professor Graf himself, and he talked of good results, but over a long period of time, there were a few complications in a 2-year follow-up. So this was not acceptable, and other articles also show that the post-operative score was not very good after long-term follow-up, mid to long-term follow-up. That's 2 years to 6 years. The second was the DNESIS, was introduced by a surgeon by the name of Dubois, and the DNESIS had some, it sorted out the problem of the Graf ligament, which was sort of giving posterior pressure, especially in extension. Now here, the DNESIS, it appears to restrict extension more than inflection with respect to a neutral posture. And this is what it changed the neutral zone to, and made it, and therefore the stresses on the DNESIS were quite high, leading to fractures that were leading to breakage of the screws. So even though they were used in many cases in spinal stenosis and other things, the long-term results of various, the complication related to implant, quite high, 11%, and various articles that I've chosen over a period of time were not found to be very encouraging. So this is the Dieter Grob's article, which says that there were quite a few complications with this over a period of time, and the range of movement was not that very good. Now here is a new device that has come in, and that is known as the Transition. In India now there are many others that are likely to be coming into the market, but this first one was introduced by Globus. Now the Transition has taken the movement axis to that level where there is a knob, and also there is a flexible rod here. So in the process it should last longer and give rise to good range of movement. So I have done close to about 150 of these transitions, and I've found it to be an interesting alternative. So these are the biomechanical data which support the survival, long-term survival in experimental basis. This was done by McAfee et al. And this is the kind of stresses that he has given, cycles equaling 30 years of a normal human being's life. And with that, the results have been quite good in the experimental stage. Now, these are the parts of the rod. You can see the end, which is close to the movement axis, and that's the knob, and this is the flexible rod that is there attached to it. So with that, if you can use hydroxyapatite coated screws is better, because the chance of loosening of these screws is less. So clinical experience, a few slides here, and nowadays we can do it by the closed method also. You can do it by the minimally invasive. It was not available till the minimally invasive is available only a few days back. So all my cases were open, and this is in degenerative young people. I've done this kind of fusion and two-level topping off. This is the post-operative, pictures, and this is the X-ray of the gentleman which you just saw a few weeks after his surgery, and the kind of range of movement that he has. Another gentleman would come to me with this kind of instrumentation with severe back pain. This was the MRI. So we fused one level and used a flexible rod in the next level, and we followed him up for close to about 2 years. Also, a few other cases where you will see flexible rod used in patients who are young, and now followed up for 1.5 years. So this is the short work that we have done. We don't necessarily need to go from a midline incision. We can go from the side, and the results have been, by and large, quite gratifying. I do not know what it is going to be at the end of 10 years, but if fusion can be avoided in certain young individuals, I think it is worthwhile. These are, again, a few cases that we have done where I reversed the position of the rod, where we have put it at a pointing toward the lower side, the flexible component. And this is the range of movement. And you can see that, by and large, I used it even in footballers. One of the footballers represents the Iraqi national team, and a year down the line, he's still playing for the football team. This is a gentleman who had come to me again with the hybrid construct, part flexible, part fusion. And with these cases, by and large now, got fairly satisfying results. It's not a good idea to use it in Alpha S1. Herein, however, I've used it, and again, the range of movement soon after surgery is pretty good. And this is what it does. Now, there are certain dreams and nightmares. The nightmare is fatigue failure and loosening. This is something that we terribly worry about. And since they have introduced hydroxyapatite screws, I feel that that might be slightly less. What is the dream? That rehydration of the disc. That would be the final happiness after doing this surgery. In the area of flexible instrumentation, will we ever invent anything that is more useful than a pot? I really don't know. Thank you very much for your. Dr. Ram Chadda on current concepts in management of lumbar canal stenosis.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's just past noon. I thank you very much for attending this session. I do apologize for the slight delay that I may have caused to this session. I was in the boardroom. I apologize for that. Without much ado and without taking any more time than I should, I would like to speak to you on current concepts in lumbar canal stenosis. I appreciate that I'm speaking after Dr. Harshvardhan Hegde because he has elaborated in detail about a lot of concepts which are going to be carried forward. The studies done by Professor Punjabi, Augustus White, and all the studies do have relevance to what are going to be adhered to or spoken to in my presentation as well. A few basic concepts to be rethought of, rediscussed. In pathogenesis, the cascade that we all talk of, it takes care and is a gradual process. Dr. Hegde showed it going in this direction. I am just enumerating those facts, that there is disc degeneration to begin with, then there's narrowing of the disc, there's a settling of the motion segment, there's a buckling of the ligamentum flavum. All these would occur simultaneously at the same level and at multiple levels, causing a micro instability. Back pain improves as the disc space collapses, and the progression occurs in 30% of cases. This is a fused lytic listhesis, auto-stabilized. Yes, this patient may have deserved what we thought was surgery 15 to 20 years back, but the natural history, it progressed into a very solid, fused, unoperated situation. 76% did not deteriorate neurologically, despite whatever you may see in such patients. Hence, in 1993, Matsunaga, who probably has the longest collection and probably the largest literature about conservative management of low back pain and lumbar canal stenosis, insisted that in his hands, a large number of patients could be treated conservatively. He also went ahead and he went and mentioned things about the natural history, and he then decided that there were certain patients who should have been operated retrospectively. 83% of the patients with neurogenic claudication or vesicorectal symptoms, which is bladder bowel involvement, even the earliest sphincter involvement, which you need to actually ask very, very leading questions to get out of the patient, are those patients who need to be looked at, critically picked up and offered surgery, rather than going with Matsunaga and treating them non-surgically. These are the patients who tend to deteriorate and have a poor final outcome if not operated. When then should one offer surgery? Persistent symptoms with reduction of quality of life. Today the whole world is talking about HRQOL, which is health-related quality of life issues, and there are various instruments to measure it. There are various scores which we can follow and find out if a patient is going from the non-surgical to the surgical level. And if we come across a patient where his health-related quality of life is worsening despite non-surgical care, minimum of 3 months, you have to think of surgery. Of course, if there is progressive neurology under our supervision, we have to offer surgery. Or if there's a bladder bowel, as I mentioned, sphincter irregularity, we have to offer surgery. What surgery do we then offer? Do we offer decompression alone? Do we offer decompression with fusion? Rather than add instrumentation to it or add confusion to it, I would stick to, do we offer instrumentation at a later time? Today we're talking of just decompression with or without fusion. Who are the patients whom I offer decompression alone? Decompression alone, you must understand how it works. It relieves the neurogenic claudication and the radicular pain. But how long will it work? And if the patient has back pain, how severe is the back pain? Is it an axial loading type of back pain? Is it affecting his or her work? If so, is it important, relevant? And a final question which we tend never to ask, will fusion, if we do it, take care of that back pain? That is something that we need to understand before we offer fusion surgery to any patient. So, if you have a person who's a claudicant, yes, we need to decompress that patient for sure. But do we really need to fuse them? Well, we need to fuse them if we feel clinico-radiologically, preoperatively, that this patient has some obvious cause which fusion will eliminate. In that case, we should offer fusion, or else we should only decompress them. Decompression without fusion, and this is again going to literature and history and whatever is mentioned in literature, Lombardi et al., and he has 2 to 7 year follow-up, gives good to excellent results. Just understand these 3 statistics. In 33 patients who had total facetectomy, that means the slip continued to progress, in 80% with preservation of facets, and in 90% with addition of posterolateral fusion, that is still uninstrumented. So this is something which we need to classically understand, that yes, if we decompress carefully, preserving the facets, we can get really good results. If we decompress irrationally, we may get short-term good results, but we will have a worsening sooner or later, and you'll have a secondary lateral canal stenosis, making the patient even worse. And if you were to look at this 80% going on to 90%, where you actually preserved the facets but added uninstrumented posterolateral fusion, you're probably getting a significant improvement where you're supposedly, when you add posterolateral fusion, fusing them in situ. Am I clear about what I'm saying? You're probably fusing them in situ. It's not necessarily always even a rigid fusion. Decompression with posterolateral fusion. The fusion group had better outcomes and lesser progression of slip in short term, that is in 3 years, but 36% had pseudarthrosis. Now this is where the next part of the evolution came in. We were getting 90% good results with decompression and posterolateral fusion, but unfortunately at 3 years, 36% had pseudarthrosis. Decompression alone, now this is a very interesting statement again, decompression alone had more bony regrowth and restenosis than arthrodesis. Now what is the meaning of this? The lateral canal which I have decompressed, all the foraminotomies that I have done, which are actually equally important in central plus lateral canal stenosis, those tend to free form bone. That means you've done a foraminotomy, so you've got a good result on day 1. That day 1 persists for 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, during which time in a lot of patients where there has been decompression alone but no fusion, there is a tendency to form new bone because of the micro instability, and there is a restenosis or a secondary canal stenosis. Now these 2 points, that is a pseudarthrosis in the presence of posterolateral fusion at the end of 3 years and bony regrowth in decompression alone, meant that yes, those with fusion did well, but there should be something which manages to keep the fusion safe. That means it should happen. So obviously came in the next step, which is instrumented posterolateral fusion. So you had instrumented fusion, which gave supposedly higher and faster fusion rates. Now this is something which is a little bit hard to sort of swallow. Well, fusion will take its own time. Yes, instrumentation protected it till the time that it fused. It maintained the alignment better. However, there was higher cost and complication rate. So we moved from decompression to decompression with posterolateral fusion, decompression with instrumentation with posterolateral fusion, the instrumentation to protect the posterolateral fusion till it works. So this is what we did, and a lot of us still practice this because there are a lot of us who still feel that once we've done the decompression and fused it in situ, guarded it with a security guard, which is the implant, the posterolateral fusion will work. Well, yes, it did work, and it worked well in certain indications. There were some people who said, why should we necessarily go and remove the posterior stabilizing structures when we do this surgery? Why not do an indirect decompression? So there is short section of people who offered an anterior surgery for this, especially in those who had monosegmental, like a degenerative listhesis with a secondary canal stenosis. Well, a lot of people offered, there were certain short reports of early degenerative listhesis where the stenosis is due to the anterior shift of the inferior facet, which was amenable to an anterior surgical procedure with indirect decompression. Again, this had very high cost, and the complication rate was related to the access in primary surgery, and God forbid, if there was a revision surgery, it was as dangerous as is revising a total disc or a TDR. So these were things which were to be taken with a pinch of salt when looking at even monosegmental decompressions. Then it moved on to what we then accepted became the gold standard, which is decompression with interbody fusion. The interbody fusions to begin with were either posterior lumbar interbody fusions or transforaminal lumbar interbody fusions. The effective thing is you got to fuse from end plate to end plate in the front after having done a disc decompression. So direct decompression was done. The reduction giving indirect decompression as well when you put in the screws and the spacer, and restored the sagittal balance, restored the lumbar lordosis, and as a few people quote, more lordosis is better than even normal lordosis, and getting an interbody fusion for pain relief and stability. Well, this stood a test of time and it worked. Whether you used standard old technique where we used rods from the rear and put in bone grafts, just bone grafts with tricortical struts as described originally by Clovard and Lin up there, or went ahead and then added a spacer in the form of titanium mesh cage originally described by Jürgen Harms, or then shifted from the mesh cage to other spacers like what we tend to use today, which is a polyethyl ether ketone or a peak spacer. Well, these are basically doing it the same way, where you have biology being provided by the corticocancellous bone chips, usually autographed, and the stability, mechanical part for the first 3 to 6 months till the bone graft fuses being provided by the spacer, either a titanium mesh or a peak spacer or tantalum or any one of the other materials that have come and have stayed, or a few have gone. Well, how do we go about it? Well, we go about it by doing surgery from the rear, which is either open or minimally invasive, as very elaborately mentioned and spoken of both by Dr. Arvind Kulkarni and Dr. Harshvardhan Hegde. Well, that's the technique part of it. The biology still remains the same. And let's talk of the biology, where in a situation here, you would go in from the rear, establish that there is frank mobility in the front by doing flexion extension maneuvers, confirming that there is a correlation between the pain in the back and the movement, and eliminating the movement hopefully will eliminate the pain. Hence, you are doing a fusion in this patient. Go in, put in your screws, rods, and then get a reduction from the rear. What I tend to do, and I strongly believe it should be done by everybody, rather than get a rod reduction, open the interspace, jack it up completely, loosen it, and then use the rod to get a reduction, rather than trying to do a rod reduction, restoring the disc space before doing an annulotomy or a discectomy. So do the annulotomy and the discectomy first, jack open the spacer, distract not between the screws but in the interbody space itself such that it loosens out, and what the screws and rod do from the rear is not much load or effort on the implant. So use the implant as an implant and not necessarily as an instrument to try and get a reduction by loosening the area which is sort of tight in the front as the first part of the surgery. Pack it with graft and then put in any spacer that you want. Well, till about 5-7 years, I used the minimally invasive spacer, which was the B-twin. Today, I've moved to the other standard spacers, which are peak polyethyl ether ketone spacers, which go in. When I use the B-twin, or I do it today also, when I use a single spacer, I do it in the form of a T-lift, which is a transforaminal lumbar interbody fusion, where I take down one facet. I normally do it from the side where there is more symptoms. That means I have to do a more elaborate decompression on that side and put in a single spacer all the way across. And I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that when I'm doing it for situations which are normally something like a grade 1, 2, or maybe up to a 3 level instability or listhesis. I'm not happy in doing it which is in frankly mobile and going all the way up and down, almost a spondyloptosis. In those situations, I try to put in 2 spacers, one from either side, because even loosening these, you need to actually open on both sides to get a symmetrical correction or a reduction. So if you're really opening from both sides, you may tend to do it in the form of a P-lift or dual spacers from either side. Well, the number of P-lifts that I do are going down as compared to the number of T-lifts. A lot of it is also dictated by the ability of the patient to pay for those 2 P-lifts or 1 T-lift, which matters in our country as compared to using just what you want. But yes, in the earlier times when these spacers were available, I would restrict using it as a PLIF or 2 from either side when they were high grade or difficult listhesis, or using a single when it was much easy to correct. This is how we go about it. The other thing which has come as a part of this study is the fact that if you are doing what is called a 360 fusion, which is doing a front and a back from the rear, you need not necessarily add posterolateral fusion if you're doing interbody. That means you would probably do a 270 and get as good a result as a 360. This is a small study which I had done where I added a lot of posterolateral fusion along with the interbody fusion, and at the end of 3 months it tends to disappear, at the end of 6 months it completely disappears, and at the end of a year it's gone. Well, I'm not too sure whether it's gone because it got resorbed or because it was rock solid in front. Either or, in whichever way, it disappeared. While the interbody showed excellent fusion from the front. So if you're doing a good interbody, you need not necessarily add posterolateral fusion in that case. You need not even necessarily dissect that beyond what is needed to identify your points of insertion. So this is just the interbody which was there. The posterolateral need not be sort of looked at. Well, this is to show you, as we said, that we did a study using a particular one-sided device as well. Well, it stood the test of time for about 3 years. In the first 3 years, I had no failures. Then I had failures with this single-sided device. I have given it up after having done about 18 to 19 cases, which I did present, and I withdrew using this single-sided stabilization. Well, it could be a salvage procedure in certain situations where you busted the other pedicle and have no other way to go. But then it may not work. Out of the 19 that I did, 3 had failed, and that was good enough for me to stop doing it unilaterally. But as I'm trying to say, you could use it as a salvage, as a one-off, because 16 of the 19 still worked. So this is just to show you that small study. Synovial cyst, again mentioned by Dr. Arvind Kulkarni, looked at as latent instabilities or hidden instabilities. Well, if you really have large cysts like this, well, you could do a microendoscopic as shown by him and just tackle the cyst. Or if you look at it as a part of a degenerative listhesis, as in this patient, you'd probably do a clearance of the whole thing and stabilize the situation and see that this fluid-filled sort of facet joint in continuity with the cyst is taken care of because it's grossly unstable. Sooner or later, the other side may also form a cyst. So clear it off and stabilize it, as we did. Moving to slightly more complex lumbar canal stenosis, where you have double level instabilities, where you have something like a degenerative scoli in addition. In these patients, you would tend to sort of look at using all modalities. Today we're getting more and more difficult patients. You have rheumatoid arthritis, you have severe osteoporosis, you have postmenopausal, you've already been operated patients, taking steroids, all these situations. You have thought to at times use everything. You have to pre-operatively build them up by build their quality of bone. We have evidence today that teriparatide given pre-operatively can help make those bones stronger. I have used it. I am working on certain papers right now where I've got pre-teriparatide DEXA scan reports and T-scores, given it for about 9 months, got a DEXA gun done again and operated on them. And believe me, I mean, I'm just here, I still have not sort of mentioned it, but if you operate on patients who have been given teriparatide for 9 months plus, the quality of bone is dramatically better. It's really, really hard bone that you can get into, and they hold it really, really well. Much superior to anything else that you may put, even putting in bone cement. So if you have an elective surgery, I would strongly recommend that in lumbar canal stenosis, don't rush in, build them up, build up the bone quality. You can put in standard screws later, which have a much superior hold as compared to any of the other bonded screws or using screws with cement in such situations. As we did here, we built them up. This is probably one of the earliest cases that I did with teriparatide, built up the lady for almost 1.5 years before going in, multi-level surgery, stabilized her. Well, right now, as I said, there was a non-inferiority of the unilateral stabilization in 16 out of the 19 patients. We enhanced screw hold by preoperative synthetic PTH therapy, as I've mentioned, teriparatide monitored by DEXA. We've still got no long-term results of the BMP which we've used. We have used BMP in certain patients where there was really no bone stock available to do these revision surgeries. Time will tell us. Moving on to the last part of the presentation. Do all lumbar canal stenosis need just a decompression or a decompression with instrumented fusion or only posterolateral fusion? Well, we are still a little bit confused, but we are trying to sort of channelize that this one will do only well with decompression, this will need uninstrumented fusion, this will need instrumented fusion. But is it that we can still stabilize them without fusing them? Well, in continuation with what Harsh has already mentioned, there are certain options of soft stabilization. I share the limited sort of evidence that I have and the experience that I have. I haven't done 180 cases as he has, but I've done a few where I would sort of, in situations where I have to decompress 2 levels, and I have look at fusing one, I would do a solid fusion at 1 level and use something which came in before the transition from the same company, which is called the soft flex rod, which I used for some time, called the AccuFlex. And it did work for some time. It was reasonably good. It protected the adjacent segment. And then I also used, besides using this, it prevented supraphysiological loading using a flexible option at the above, which is like a spring-loaded device at the adjacent level. This is what the rod looks like. It had actually got FDA approval for only a fusion at a single level, but we tended to use the hard part of the rod for fusion and this for the non-fusion option. I also used the similar sort of option which came from another company called the Isobar TTL, where I did fusions at 1 level and used this cylindrical construct at the above, which also had a similar concept. It had a spring-loaded device in the center, worked as well as the AccuFlex. Both not commonly available today, transition available at a fairly high cost, not afforded by most patients except those going to Harshvardhan Hegde. The non-fusion options, I'm not saying that they always protect the adjacent segment. I still have had adjacent segment disease despite using non-fusion options, and I have been using them for more than a decade now. So it means that probably it protects the surgeon for some time, that this may not happen, but I have had patients where I have put this and I've gone and this is been put there, and this same patient with that option above, a very famous film producer, without taking his name, had an adjacent segment disease above the soft fusion option. So I had to again go back and do a conventional surgery and decompressed him and went all the way up. This is how he was earlier, and he had developed an adjacent segment adjacent to the adjacent segment, and I went all the way up and fused him. There are other options as shown earlier, which is when you have back pain, claudication, middle-aged lady, you don't want to fuse but you still want to stabilize, use the simplest option, which is in the form of a Dinesis, maybe even a short segment like this. I have not had any good results from the Graf ligament. Harshvardhan Hegde has been extremely polite to the Graf ligament. I probably have seen a little more of the Graf ligament experience after somebody else having put them in. So I'm not very polite with the Graf ligament. I would prefer the option 2 and 3 that you suggested, not the Graf ligament. Doesn't work too well. Well, the AccuFlex short series, not much to comment on. Probably looks after a few patients, middle-aged, yes. DIAM, interspinous spacers that he spoke of, again similar thoughts, not very happy. You have to really look for that middle-aged young patient who has only got bilateral symmetrical lateral canal stenosis, and in that patient you could probably use a DIAM. But then most of those patients are like the ones seated in this room who don't want surgery. So a lot of us have a little bit of this so-called lateral canal stenosis at 1 level, and we don't opt for surgery, we just bear it till we become really bad and buy a fusion. So the DIAM came, so did the other interspinous processes. The Coflex has got some approval. The X-Top got an approval against which I've spoken in some years back, and I know how they got the approval, so we would not comment on that anymore. The other interesting part, a lot of these non-fusion options, they compare apples with oranges to get approvals. They compared it with the PLIF, and they said that it works as well or a non-inferiority over the PLIF. Just like the disc replacement got a non-inferiority against the ALIF. So I don't know how these studies are done, but so that's how it is. ASD or anterior adjacent segment disease is a fact, but preventing it or managing it is still fiction. You may love it or hate it. Non-fusion is here to stay. Whether it's going to be the disc replacement, which still works in India but has stopped working as well in America, or whether it's going to be something else, I don't know. My take-home message of this talk, I have no take-home messages. I just have certain fears that I would like to express. Should we stop doing fusions for the fear of adjacent segment disease? I don't know. Should we do multi-level discography before doing all fusions? Well, I haven't tried it. Those in the auditorium who have, please share your experience. Should we do a CT mile or a dynamic MRI like a phonar in all patients? Well, when we have it, we'll probably do it, but I'm not too sure how we'll interpret those results. Are we looking for a better or safer arthroplasty? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I still feel that we will have a safer arthroplasty from the front, from the side, or from the rear someday. Are non-arthroplasty, non-fusion options working? I don't know. I'm still not sure whether gene therapy or stem cells will have some role in all this. which is going to be genetic bioengineering, which is going to make a breakthrough, I don't know. Well, there's only one evidence in literature which is available, much similar to what I've shared with you, and which is a white paper written by our own colleague, Dr. Dilip Sen Gupta. I'll read this out for you, and that's where my lecture would end. But every word here is gospel truth. Understand it, and please sort of follow it. Decompression primarily relieves radicular symptoms and neurogenic claudication, whereas fusion primarily relieves back pain by elimination of instability. Full stop. The goals for instrumentation are to promote fusion and to correct deformity. Full stop. Fusion has a better long-term outcome than decompression alone. There is evidence that instrumentation improves fusion rate but does not improve clinical outcome in a relatively short-term follow-up. However, outcome of pseudarthrosis cases deteriorates over time, and solid fusion produces better long-term outcome. The benefit of instrumentation comes with a price of higher post-operative morbidity and complication rate. BMP are being tried to increase the rate of fusion without increasing the complication rate, but the cost is prohibitive. More recently, dynamic stabilization with instrumentation but without fusion has been introduced as an alternative treatment. This is where we are. This is where the evidence in literature ends today. What's going to happen tomorrow, I don't know. The battle will be on. We will be fighting in this very auditorium few years from today. Fusion versus non-fusion, minimally invasive versus open, instrumented versus non-instrumented. Maybe there'll be people fighting for gene therapy versus biologics versus metal, cost effectiveness versus safety. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Chadda, for your nice talk. Thank you, Dr. Chadda, for your nice talk, nice and elaborative talk. May I request Dr. Shyam Sundar Bhatt is here. He will speak on the thoracolumbar and lumbar fractures.
Back on 12 to 1. 12 to 1 money.
Good afternoon, everybody. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk on this dais. Respected chairpersons, this is a talk on thoracolumbar and lumbar fractures. Greetings from Manipal. This is my hospital, Kasturba Hospital, Manipal. I would like to brief on introduction, applied anatomy, spinal stability, clinical evaluation of the patient, radiographic evaluation, classification, and how to decide on treatment and overview of the treatment. The epidemiological data on spinal trauma in India is lacking. However, annual incidence in different reports across the globe tells that the spinal column injury constitute about 19 to 18 per 100,000, and spinal cord injury is 15 to 50 per million. Most common cause in India is a fall from height, whereas in the Western world it is a road traffic accident in the spinal injuries. We have to rule out multiple injuries in these patients like fracture neck of the femur, hip dislocations, and bilateral calcaneum fractures. Coming to the applied anatomy, I have divided into thoracic spine, thoracolumbar region, lumbar spine, and the cord injuries. Fractures of the thoracic spine, T2 to T10, are rare due to increased stability of the thoracic spine. That is due to increased rigidity by the articulation with the ribs. Ribs are articulating with the sternum, adding secondary stability. Facet joints are oriented in a coronal plane, and discs are thin and increased stiffness, adding rotational stability. And kyphosis concentrate the axial load on the anterior column. Based on this, the stability in the thoracic spine is more. So most common injuries in the thoracic spine are burst fractures, osteoporotic fractures, and fracture dislocations. And fracture dislocations are rare but leads to paralysis in almost 80% of the cases. Coming to thoracolumbar junction, it is from D11 to L2. More than 50% of all thoracic and lumbar fractures occur in this region, most commonly affected by spinal trauma due to fulcrum of motion between the stiff thoracic spine and mobile lumbar spine. The most common injuries here are the thoracolumbar burst fractures and the flexion distraction, that is the chance fractures. In the lumbar region, the neural elements occupy only about 1/3 of the spinal canal, hence the spinal cord injuries or the cauda equina injury is having a better prognosis than the injuries in the thoracic or thoracolumbar junction. The middle thoracic spine has a watershed area. This is a vascular injury can lead to cord ischemia and spinal cord damage. The spinal cord ends at cauda equina and the cauda equina begins at the level of L1, L2 as we all know, and the level can vary. Hence, it is very important to identify the beginning of the cauda equina in the magnetic resonance imaging in relation to the pathology. And injuries below L1 will have better prognosis. Stability of the spine has been described by Holsworth in 1963 as a 2-column theory and later by Dennis in 1983 as a 3-column theory. In 2-column theory, the spine is stable if the posterior ligaments are intact, and in the 3-column theory, the column is said to be unstable the spine is said to be unstable if more than 2 columns are injured. Clinical evaluation, patients are evaluated based on the trauma or advanced trauma life support protocols like airway, breathing and circulation, Glasgow Coma Scale and secondary surveys. Spine examination to be done, inspection and palpation of the entire spine is to be done, and to be thorough in the examination, and patient should be log rolled for the same. Neurological examination consists of motor examination, assessment of the lumbar and sacral root function, sensory testing and reflex examination. We all know the muscle power grading by the MRC grading. The sacral and lumbar root function as tested by the hip abduction, knee extension, knee flexion, great toe extension and great toe flexion. The dermatological sensory testing is done as in the picture. Examination of the reflexes, abdominal reflexes, cremasteric reflex, knee, ankle and anal wink, knee jerk, ankle jerk and anal wink, bulbocavernous reflex and plantar response. These are all tested. Plantar response tells about whether there is a continuity between the brain and the cord. What is spinal shock? It is a physiological disruption of the spinal cord function characterized by absence bulbocavernous reflex. As we all know how to elicit the bulbocavernous reflex. In a spinal shock, there is no bulbocavernous reflex, there is flaccid paralysis, hypotonia and areflexia, and it lasts from hours to days. And when the patient recovers from spinal shock, there is positive bulbocavernous reflex, hyperreflexia, spasticity and clonus. Patient may be in a state of neurogenic shock due to disruption of the descending sympathetic outflow, no sympathetic response and unresponse to vagal stone characterized by cardiovascular instability. That is, patient will have hypotension and bradycardia. The spinal cord injury can be graded based on Frankel's classification or more recently American Spinal Injury Association, that is Asia classification. Comparing complete versus incomplete cord injuries. In complete cord injury, there is no function below the level of injury and absence of sensation and voluntary movement in the perianal area. Whereas in the incomplete injury, there is preservation of sensation in the perianal area and voluntary control of anal sphincter will be preserved. In the radiographic examination, we do the trauma series and AP lateral view of the entire spine is to be done, and we have to rule out non-contiguous injury like fractures at multiple levels or involving the other injuries like hip injuries and the calcaneum injuries. CT scan should be done in all cases of suspected injury to posterior elements or posterior vertebral body. Myelogram is largely replaced by MRI. It is indicated in all cases of neurological deficit. Is a controversial issue. However, it is useful to know the intrinsic and extrinsic cord injuries. This paper, Neurological Deficit and Canal Compromise in Thoracolumbar and Lumbar Burst Fractures, has been published by our institution. It says no correlation between the degree of canal encroachment and initial neurological deficit. Neurological recovery and initial canal compromise also there is no correlation, and there is no correlation between the spinal canal remodeling and neurological recovery at the time of follow-up. The fractures can be classified as per the AO into type A, type B and type C, and each category is divided based on the fracture morphology, bony versus ligamentum failure and direction of the displacement. And in simple, they can be classified as compression fractures, burst fractures, flexion distraction injuries and fracture dislocations. How to design on management? In a compression fracture, there is failure of the anterior column. So if there is 50% loss of vertebral height and less than 30-degree kyphosis and single level involvement, we call it as a stable fracture. Otherwise, we call it as unstable. In a burst fracture, failure of anterior and middle column occurs due to axial compression with or without failure of the posterior column, as in compression or tensile force, and it is very commonly seen in the thoracolumbar junction. In a burst fracture, in neurologically intact patients, less than 20 to 30 degree of kyphosis, 45 to 50 degree of canal compromise, the management differs from a patient who is having more than 20 to 30 degree of kyphosis and more than 45 to 50 degree of canal compromise. Whereas in neurologically compromised patient, the management is almost surgical. Decompression is indicated in complete cord injuries for early stabilization, and neurological outcome is not changed by decompression in complete spinal cord injury. Whereas in incomplete spinal cord injury, stabilization and decompression have it is beneficial, there is no controversy, but how to do it is a controversial issue. Usually posterior decompression is done by indirect decompression by distraction and ligamentotaxis, or by direct transpedicular or posterolateral, or anterior decompression can be done for large midline fragment or incomplete spinal cord injuries, or more than 2 weeks since injury. Following posterior decompression, if there is inadequate decompression by the posterior approach, and a partial or complete corpectomy needs to be done. Recent literature shows that pedicular screws in the fractured vertebra, and there should not be distraction, so that there is no void is created for better union. There are many literature shows that the treatment of vertebral fractures with short segment pedicular screw with pedicular screw at the fracture level. The effect of posterior instrumentation of the spine on canal dimensions and neurological recovery in thoracolumbar and lumbar burst fractures. This study again was done by in our institution, published. It says that posterior instrumentation produces better canal remodeling than the patient treated non-operatively. However, there is